Let's look now at the covenant term again. We've said that there's really only one term to this covenant, right? God says, do not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you do, you surely will die. This one-term covenant. Basically, do anything you want to do. Live in the garden. I've made provision for you. All the fruit of the trees are yours, even the fruit of the tree of life, which is right in the center of the garden next to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The two key trees, two trees that really remind Adam and Eve of what the provision of God is, what he provides, and the one prohibition, just don't eat of that one tree. Now, let's ask the question though, what is so bad about having the knowledge of good and evil? There's been a lot of debate about this through the centuries, but I think that in recent years, there's been an increasing consensus among Bible scholars that what's really being said here in this phrase, knowledge of good and evil, is not simply knowing about good and evil, the way we might use the word knowledge. Rather, the phrase, knowledge of good and evil, in this context, refers to not simply knowing about, but rather refers to the authority that a king would have within his kingdom to decide what is good and what is evil. In other words, what is right and what is wrong, what the laws are. This phrase, then, is more than knowing about. It is a decision to become the lawgiver. So we could rephrase God's prohibition this way. What God's saying is, do not eat of the fruit of thinking that you can become God and create your own laws. Rather, trust the laws that I've given you and live into that relationship. And really the only law at this point is, don't try to become God. Rather, trust me as God. It's a trust question right from the beginning. We'll see that covenant always involves trust as its very core. And so God's asking them to trust him. One-term covenant. Just don't try to be God. Let God be God, and let us trust him as God. Now, one might ask the question, why would God do this? Why put two trees in the garden, one the tree of life, and one a tree that if they eat of it, could actually ruin the entire relationship, could bring death to his covenant partners? Is this God's one mistake? Why didn't God simply put the tree of life in the center of the garden, say, eat freely of it, and live happily ever after? Now, of course, the problem there is that if there's no choice, if it's not possible to say no to God, then in fact, one isn't really saying yes to God. This comes down to the mystery of freedom and why freedom is always tied to the notion of love. It's just the case that what we call love, particularly agape love, choice-based love, is a love that cannot be forced on someone. To say, love me at gunpoint is not love. Or to say, love me, and I'll give you no other options than to love me, is not love. By putting the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one prohibition, God was actually allowing humans the choice whether to love or not. Because for agape love to exist, it requires some degree of choice. So what we see there in that first opening covenantal moment is God creating his image, entering into relationship with them with a one-term covenant in which the one term really is, trust me to be God and for you to be my people, to be my physical representatives on earth, to be his stewards over this creation, his vice regents, really to be princes and princesses under his kingly rule, turning the creation over to us. He told us in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, that we are to rule over and steward the animal kingdom and the earth. And so in this calling, we are to be vice regents of the living God, stewards of the king. Just don't try to take the king's throne. That's the only prohibition. Very shortly, as in really the next verse, chapter 2, verse 18, God starts to address another covenantal issue. In Genesis 2:18, we hear these words, "And God saw that the man was alone, and it was not good." Now the man, Adam, was alone, and it was not good. This is the first time in the creation text we've heard the words "not good." In chapter 1, every time God does something, end of each day, he looks and says, "Behold, it was very good." Or actually, good, good, good. And on the final day, he summed it up with very good. But this time, God sees Adam is alone and says, that is not good. Those words should just jump out at us. First time, something's not good. And it's not that it's evil. It's just that it's not complete. Something's not right yet. And so what it says is that God, seeing that Adam is alone, brings all the animals to Adam and has him begin to name them. And as the animals all walk by and get their names from Adam, at the end of that text, it says that, and yet, no helper was found suitable for Adam. I guess we could say this is the first dating service planet Earth has ever seen, and it didn't go so well. All of the parties that were to get paired up with Adam at the end says, it doesn't quite fit, right? I haven't found someone that's suitable, a partner suitable for me. So, what does God do? Well, the text says that God takes Adam and puts him into a deep sleep. This is an important phrase for the Genesis author, because we'll see that a few chapters later, Abraham's going to go into a deep sleep, and something very covenantal will happen there as well. So basically, God is putting his covenant partner into a restful, peaceful state, and God is solving a covenant problem. God puts Adam to sleep, and out of Adam, the text says, he takes and makes a second person. The one becomes two. Now, why? Well, clearly in the text, this second person, the woman who's going to be named Eve shortly, is the perfect partner for Adam. It's that partner he could not find among the animals. And the word there, we have to be clear about that word. It's usually translated helper in Genesis 2, that God is going to create a helper for Adam. Now the word azer is what we translate, the Hebrew word azer is what we translate as helper. We have to be careful with that word though, because frequently the English word helper has been interpreted to mean something less than Adam. It's like Adam's going to be the CEO, and the woman's going to be the assistant, someone less and more inferior, just someone who helps. We got to remember that the word azer, it's helper, but let's remember that many times in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, God himself is called the azer of Israel, the helper of Israel. And there's no way that means that Israel's up here and God's just a little assistant. In other words, one can be a helper even if one is God. It's not telling you where you're placed in terms of value or hierarchy. It's saying that you're partnering with this person. Adam is having a partner made for him specifically and especially by God. And they're going to partner together. And what's important is that in chapter 1, both man and woman are called the image of God. Equal value, equal dignity, equal worth, equal calling on their lives. So as God takes Adam and puts him to sleep and takes woman from Adam, he takes the one to become two, only to turn around again with the two and put them back into one relationship. So the one becomes two to become one again. But the last one is different from the first one, right? The first one is a single solitary individual. The last one is a one flesh relationship. It's two who are in some mysterious way united in a covenant relationship. Now what Adam says when he wakes up and sees this woman for the first time, the text says that Adam says, "This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." Now that phrase is really important in the Hebrew context. We find that bone and flesh and bone, are used a number of times in the Old Testament to signal family, kinship. In other words, this is a covenant formula. Adam is acknowledging that this woman is of his own flesh and blood, his own family. They are kinship. They are man and wife. This is the first example, the prototype of a marriage covenant. And that's why, for all of history, Jews and Christians have looked back on this text as their creational example of what God's looking for in the marriage relationship. And so the text says, for the reason that God created this flesh and blood covenant relationship between husbands and wives, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife. Now, leaving and cleaving are covenant terms as well. Cleaving often is used in the context of cleaving or connecting to a covenant partner. So it's the husband, the father and mother give birth to children who then cleave to each other to form new family units. And this text says in Genesis 2:24, and so they become one flesh. Through this covenantal cleaving, they literally become one new family unit, one flesh. Now, from this point on, and we see this both in Jewish and Christian history, as well as a number of other cultures around the world, sexual union, that one fleshing between husband and wife, is identified as the sign of the marriage covenant. From this point onward in history, particularly for Jews and Christians, sex within a male-female marriage is the only context where it's not a violation of people. Why? Because in this creation account, God identifies that the oath sign, every covenant we'll see has a particular sign, a physical representation, a living reality that one can see and experience of the spiritual dimensions of the covenant that we can't see. Right? When a couple, say, walks down an aisle to be married, says their vows, and then walks back, as you look at them, you don't see anything different. The covenant is a spiritual reality of relationship in the spirit realm that we can't see. So what God has people do is to have signs of covenants that give us visible, experienceable reminders of what the spiritual reality of the covenant actually is. And that's how sexual union now works for the rest of Scripture. It's why God cares so much about how human beings conduct our sexuality. It isn't that God's a prude or has a problem with sex like some people in the early church sort of painted it. But instead, the biblical view, both through the Old and New Testaments, is that God He's for sex within the male-female marriage covenant because that's the covenant where God designed the specific sign for. Every covenant has its own particular type of sign. We'll notice that God, when He does covenants with humans, He usually articulates what the sign is. And humans can't change it. It just is what God creates it to be. With that, we look finally at that final verse in Genesis 2, the end of this covenantal moment between the first man and woman, the first human covenant relationship. And there'll be more. There'll be many more types of covenants between humans, friendship covenants, church covenants, lots of other covenants. But notice the first one sort of has to be the marriage covenant because it's through the male-female covenanting in marriage and the sexual union that more human beings will be born, will come forth to create more covenant partners. That's why I think this first covenant is the marriage covenant. It's the one that produces more human beings through procreation that allows now other covenantal relationships to flourish. But the final words we hear, Genesis 2, verse 25, is that the man and the woman were naked, but they were not ashamed. I think this is a beautiful picture, really the last beautiful picture of the garden before things turn south as we head into chapter 3. The last picture is man and woman naked. Now the point here, I think we can say, is that nakedness in the ancient world, just like today, can represent vulnerability, openness, nothing hidden. What it's saying is the man and the woman were absolutely vulnerable, open to God and each other, hiding nothing, and they were not ashamed. There was no shame in their vulnerability, their openness, and their nakedness. One might say this pristine view, this vision of the garden, this world that God dreamt when he had humanity in mind, is one where human beings are so focused on love for God and others, themselves and creation, that there's no place for shame in this world. When your attention is so focused on God and others, C.S. Lewis says, you just sort of forget about yourself. It becomes everything is in harmony. Nothing is hidden, nothing to hide from. And this lack of shame is exactly what God's heart was for humanity. Where there is love, there's neither shame nor fear. This is the last beautiful moment, this picture we have on the close of Genesis chapter 2. Humanity covenanted with God, covenanted with each other, and about to begin to spread these images of God, these human beings, across the world, to multiply and fill the earth with the image of the living God.